On Channel 9 at 10 o'clock. They'll be showing a documentary called Memory of the Camps, and it is the narrated version of perhaps some of the things that you've seen, which was the liberation of either Dachau or Bergen-Belsen by the British troops. By now you're pretty steeled to some of the things that you've seen, but it is about the British liberation of the camp. As you know, that we're celebrating or commemorating the 60th anniversary of lots of different events, and one of them is the liberation of Belsen. I would also like to point out there has been a lot of talk about liberating the camps, and most of the survivors who I've talked to, most of the survivors that I've talked to don't really like the term liberated. Many of them feel that they were discovered. So that's tonight at 10 o'clock on Channel 9, Memory of the Camps. On Sunday, we've talked with you at 2 o'clock. We're going to have the Yom HaShoah Remembrance, and it will take place on campus in Cooperage at 2 o'clock. And that is our annual commemoration of the Holocaust. Students, of course, are interested in the response paper that is due on 5/12. There is no special prompt for that. The instructions for that paper are in the syllabus, and we ask you to follow it, and that to use for your guide, once again, the rubric that was handed out to you and the guidelines that were handed out to you with the first response paper. The Human Rights Club is still sponsoring a fundraiser at Baja Fresh. Every time you eat at Baja Fresh and mention that you're eating there simply because of the Human Rights Club, 15% of your total bill is donated to the club, and from what I can understand, they're beginning to collect money. And the more people that could do that, that would be a kind of a very nice way for you to contribute to their efforts. They are also still selling T-shirts and green, not on our watch, bracelets. If you would like to buy either one of those, the T-shirts are $12 and the bracelets are $3. After the lecture, in their traditional corner of the auditorium, they'll be taking orders. Yes?
Bracelets actually aren't here yet. They're still being shipped, so if you want, I can get your name down.
Okay. You can give your name. And the T-shirts, it would be nice to have some payment ahead of time, right? $12. Check made out to the Human Rights Club. I think those are all, yes? No tickets, free to the public.
Just first come, first serve?
There'll be plenty of room.
Exodus 1947, you need to buy tickets.
Yes, you do need to buy tickets for Exodus 1947, and they'll probably be available on Sunday.
Yeah.
If not, does someone else?
You can call the Rialto.
You can call the Rialto. I also received something today from the Lark Theater in Larkspur. I'm not sure that this isn't playing at Rialto. Does anyone know if the Rialto is showing paper clips? Does it ring a bell to anyone? Well, before you go to Larkspur, to the Lark Theater to see Paperclips, check and see whether it's at the Rialto. Students in this very class participated in this project. And what happened was some students in a very small town in the South, in Tennessee, began studying about the Holocaust. And it was incomprehensible to them what the number 6 million people meant. And this is the story of how they began collecting paper clips. It kind of snowballed because they received well over 6 million. I think it was over 12 million. People began hearing about it and began sending them. So Paper Clips is a documentary about what those children in Tennessee did. And it's at the Lark Theater, but I think that probably it's playing at the Rialto as well. You need to check their listings. Now we come to the lecturer for today. Our lecturer is someone who you know quite well. Our colleague and good friend, Barbara McCaffrey. She doesn't need a lot of introduction, so why don't you welcome her? And hopefully everything's working.
You all know what noise this is going to make. It's not as bad as usual. This is one of those times that gives me enormous pleasure because it's not often teaching about the Holocaust I get to do the thing I trained in as a graduate student, which is talk about poetry and literature. And today's talk is really meant to give you an introduction to the huge range of material that's been written about the Holocaust. It includes diaries and letters of those who did not survive the Nazi genocide of the Jews, and that will be our main focus today, as well as fictional and non-fictional works by those who survived the camps and ghettos, survived by being hidden, often in attics and in basements, by passing as non-Jewish, or by being able to escape before the doors closed. We'll also be exploring the works of those who were alive in other countries during the war, and the subsequent generation of writers, including those who were children of survivors. We'll end with two quick examples from the Armenian genocide, which we studied earlier this semester, and the Rwandan genocide, which will be the focus for next week's lecture. I thought it'd be nice to have a little segue, a way of connecting what you did today with what we'll be exploring later. Let's see. I think I'm going to be dependent on Jessica's help. What I want to do is just give you a brief glimpse into what some of the writers explore when they're looking at Holocaust literature. You can go to the next slide when you can, Jessica. It's not working. Okay. In the introduction to her encyclopedia of writers and their work, S. Lillian Kramer speaks of it as a literature of witness and mourning, which explores the trauma of its implications on post-war thought. Another essay by Alvin Rosenfeld says that that Holocaust literature extends so far as to force us to contemplate what may be the fundamental changes in our modes of perception and expression, our altered way of being in the world. We're close. We're only one slide behind. So if we can go back one. We may not be able to. Noted feminist scholar Susan Gubar reminds us of the injunction of Theodor Adorno, a Jewish philosopher and social critic who left Germany in 1934. In 1949, he said, "To write poetry after Auschwitz is barbaric." We're finally in sync, thank you. In her study of poetry after the Holocaust, she says that despite the difficulties of knowing how to speak of the dead, how to speak to the dead, how to speak for the dead, what the dying of the last Holocaust survivors at the turn of the century teaches us is the necessity of keeping the Holocaust alive, now through the exertions of those who never struggled with its ghastly regimes. For her, poetry can promote mindfulness about how the past continues to exist in the present as an outrage. And I'd add how it shapes us and helps us grapple with genocides that have happened on our own watch. For many of those who write about Holocaust literature, they're really speaking about its power to counteract the silence, as the voices of those who experienced it directly have either faded or not survived. As Gubar says, for those of us attempting to acknowledge irreversible losses, poetry refuses and refutes a silencing which would constitute a victory of the forces of evil. So having these words really helps us in not losing sight of, not losing mindfulness of what happened during the Holocaust. The work we're about to sample, letters, diaries, poetry, and fiction, I couldn't resist. There are a number of writers, but trust me, I took some of them out against my better judgment this morning, so we wouldn't use the whole time. These works can teach us how to inhabit, at least momentarily, events in history that we can neither escape or transcend. Please join me on the journey in which we view images and hear the words of those whose words add, I hope amplify, those of the scholars and survivors that we've already explored this semester. My hope is these fragments and poems will amplify your understanding of the impact of genocide and compel you to act when you see injustice. I suggest you jot down the themes you discover in these works and your questions so we can discuss them a bit at the end of the presentation. Can you move it? Wonderful. Next slide. The first writer I wanted us to have a chance to get to know is Etty Hilson. She was born in 1914, and she's from the Netherlands. She spent time in the transport camp, the transit camp at Westerbork. We've heard that name before, often associated with Anne Frank. Her mother actually fled from Tsarist Russia to the Netherlands after World War II. Her diaries describe the intense isolation and segregation Dutch Jews experienced while awaiting their impending deportation to the camps in Poland. Over 82% of the Dutch Jewish population who were deported, of those 82%, only 5% survived the war. What makes her work so unusual and so hard to place is that her journals show that precisely when the Nazis closed in on her, Hilson managed to gradually liberate herself from fear and hatred to the point of complete understanding and acceptance of what was to come. We can get to the next. This is a segment from her diary, which was published as an interrupted life. Very well then, this new certainty that what they are after is our total destruction. I accept it. I know it now, and I shall not burden the others with my fears. I work and continue to live with the same conviction, and I find life meaningful. My life has, so to speak, been extended by death, by my looking death in the eye and accepting it, by accepting destruction as a part of life, and no longer wasting my energies on fear of death or the refusal to acknowledge its inevitability. It sounds paradoxical. By excluding death from our life, we cannot live a full life, and by admitting death into our life, we enlarge it and enrich it. And these are images from Westerbork. The next two writers that I want to, actually the next three, are probably the most prominent writers whose works have really helped shape our understanding of the Holocaust. The first is Elie Wiesel, who was 16 when the war ended. He came from an area that, during the war, became Romania. His family was deported to Auschwitz in the spring of 1944. At the end of the war, he and a group of orphan children from concentration camps were taken to France. While insisting on addressing the Holocaust as its specifically Jewish dimensions, Wiesel has argued that the legacy of the Holocaust compels one to intervene on behalf of victims worldwide, particularly those threatened by state-sponsored persecution. How many of you had a chance to read Night? I know we've asked this question before. This may be familiar. It's a passage about the time after his father was beaten. It starts with bending over him. Bending over him, I stayed gazing at him for over an hour, engraving into myself the picture of his blood-stained face, his shattered skull. Then I had to go to bed. I climbed into my bunk above my father, who was still alive. It was January 28th, 1945. I awoke on January 29th at dawn. In my father's place lay another invalid. They must have taken him away before the dawn and carried him to the crematory. He may still have been breathing. Next. There were no prayers at his grave. No candles were lit to his memory. His last word was my name, a summons to which I did not respond. I did not weep, and it pained me that I could not weep. But I had no more tears, and in the depth of my being, in the recesses of my weakened conscience, could I have searched it, I might perhaps have found something like, free at last. And this is an image of some of the beds. It almost reminds me of Lillian's story in the brick factory, of the shelving that people slept on. The next writer is Primo Levi. Born in 1919 in Italy, he belonged to a small and largely assimilated Jewish community in Turin, with its roots back into the Sephardic communities of Spain and southern France. With the fall of fascism in Italy in 1943 and Italy's armistice with the Allies in that year, everything changed. He joined the armed resistance against the fascists and the Nazi occupiers of northern Italy, but he was betrayed very quickly and captured and was deported to Auschwitz. He remained in one of the work camps until liberation by the Red Army in 1945. Some of you may have read his work, Survival in Auschwitz. There's something about this that has the incantation of flavor of a very prominent Jewish prayer, of reminding your children about their heritage. So he's used some of this kind of lyrical quality in the poem, which gives it, for those who are familiar with the prayer, a kind of added meaning. You who live safe in your warm houses, you who find, returning in the evening, hot food and friendly faces, consider if this is a man who works in the mud, who does not know peace, who fights for a scrap of bread, who dies because of a yes or a no. Consider if this is a woman without hair and without name, with no more strength to remember, her eyes empty and her wound cold like a frog in winter. Meditate that this came about. And this is the part from the prayer. I commend these words to you. Carve them in your hearts, at home and in the street. Go to bed rising. Repeat them to your children. Or may your house fall apart. May illness impede you. May your children turn their faces from you. And so what he's asking us to do is really remember. And I think the images he gives us are ones that we've heard from those on our survivor panels, particularly about losing your name, becoming a number, losing your hair. And an image of Auschwitz, which I think some of you have seen some more images of Auschwitz. Any questions on what I've covered so far? Am I going too fast or too slow? Have I put you to sleep yet? Doesn't look like anybody's blinked out yet, so that's a good sign. All right, the next writer is Paul Celan. He's probably the most important German-speaking poet since 1945, or at least poet of the Holocaust, who uses that as his primary subject. He's also from the area of Bukovina, which became part of Romania. He was born into an assimilated family, and there was a point at which the Russians and the Romanians were taking the town back and forth, and during that time, thousands of Jews were killed in the first 48 hours of this battle for his area. He recognized the looming danger and went into hiding, but couldn't persuade his parents to join him. His father died of typhoid fever in the camp, and his mother was shot. He was later sent to forced labor in the Romanian labor detachment. You might remember one of our speakers talking about being in a forced labor camp in Estonia. There may be some parallels there. Like the poets of his homeland, Celan defiantly continued to write poetry in German in spite of his traumatic experiences during the war and the fact that he lived in a non-German linguistic environment. As a result, he was confronted with the dilemma of being a victim of the Shoah, which is the Hebrew word for Holocaust, and a poet writing in the language of those who murdered the Jewish people. Kind of irony there. Many people after the war chose to write in other languages, like we'll see an example of Dan Pages, who after the war learned Hebrew and began to write in Hebrew. Death Fugue is Celan's, in essence, prayer for the dead, or Kaddish, for his murdered parents and the victims of the Holocaust. And let's see if we can get things working. This is going to be challenging, because what we're going to be doing is listening to him read this poem in German, Todesfuge, and the translation will be on the screen, hopefully slightly in sync. Okay, the poem begins.
Todesfuge. Schwarze Milch der Frühe, wir trinken sie abends, wir trinken sie mittags und morgens, wir trinken sie nachts, wir trinken und trinken. Wir schaufeln ein Grab in den Lüften, da liegt man nicht eng. Ein Mann wohnt im Haus, der spielt mit den Schlangen, der schreibt, wenn es dunkelt nach Deutschland, dein goldenes Haar, Margarete. Er schreibt es und tritt vor das Haus, und es blicken die Sterne, er pfeift seine Rüden herbei, er pfeift seine Juden hervor, lässt schaukeln ein Grab in der Erde. Er befiehlt uns, spielt auf nun zum Tanz. Schwarze Milch der Frühe, wir trinken dich nachts, wir trinken dich morgens und mittags, wir trinken dich abends, wir trinken und trinken. Ein Mann wohnt im Haus, der spielt mit den Schlangen, der schreibt, wenn es dunkelt, nach Deutschland, dein goldenes Haar, Margarete, dein aschenes Haar, Sulamit. Wir schaukeln ein Grab in den Lüften, da liegt man nicht eng. Er ruft, stecht tiefer ins Erdreich, ihr einen, ihr anderen spielt weiter zum Tanz auf. Er greift nach den Alten in Wucht, er schwingt, seine Augen sind blau. Stecht tiefer die Spaten, ihr einen, ihr anderen spielt weiter zum Tanz auf. Schwarze Milch der Frühe, wir trinken dich nachts, wir trinken dich mittags und morgens, wir trinken dich abends, wir trinken und trinken. Ein Mann wohnt im Haus, dein goldenes Haar, Margarete, dein aschenes Haar, Sulamit, er spielt mit den Schlangen. Er ruft, spielt süßer den Tod, der Tod ist ein Meister aus Deutschland. Er ruft, streicht dunkler die Geigen, dann steigt ihr euch raus in die Luft. Dann habt ihr ein Grab in den Wolken, dann liegt man nicht eng. Schwarze Milch der Frühe, wir trinken dich nachts, wir trinken dich mittags, der Tod ist ein Meister aus Deutschland. Wir trinken dich abends und morgens, wir trinken und trinken. Der Tod ist ein Meister aus Deutschland, sein Auge ist blau. Er trifft dich mit bleierner Kugel, er trifft dich genau. Ein Mann wohnt im Haus, dein goldenes Haar, Margarete. Er legt seine Rüden auf uns, er schenkt uns ein Grab in der Luft. Er spielt mit den Schlangen und träumet. Der Tod ist ein Meister aus Deutschland. Dein goldenes Haar, Margarete. Dein aschenes Haar, Sulamit.
I heard a couple of gasps. What are the reactions? In what way, hearing this poem in German and seeing it in English, how did that help? Did it give you a sense of the power of the poem, she says, trying to lead you into this? Any comments? Anybody willing to take a stab?
Understood the intensity, but I hear him say how his emotions show through how he said.
Yeah, so what he was saying is we could read it, but we got the intensity and the power of it by hearing his words. And we'll have copies of these available to you of all the poems, so that if you want to look at these afterward, you'll have a chance to. The central image is really of the mother usurped, her milk replaced by panic, this black milk, along with the title emphasizing the horror of the camp orchestra, a death, a fugue, a musical piece that many were required to play and that accompanied either the people arriving at the camps or the digging of graves. It's really surreal in a way, and what it might mean to be transported out of the horizon of fear after being branded for death as a child. So how does he reconcile his experience as a survivor? And I think I'm remembering Lung Ung's words, learning to live with peace. And how do you live with peace? We're going to move now into a segment of memoirs written by young people who survived the Holocaust, either because they were hidden or they passed as being non-Jewish. And the first writer I wanted to talk about is Rolla Belka. I've kind of done it chronologically, so she was the youngest at the time of the war. She was born in Krakow in 1938. Her family ended up in the Krakow ghetto. And many of you have seen Schindler's List, and you remember there were very few scenes in which there was any color in the film. It was mainly black and white, but there was a striking image of a girl in a strawberry red coat. It turns out lots of little girls had strawberry red coats, but she was certainly one of them. Her mother managed to sneak her daughter out and herself out of the ghetto, and they lived with a Polish family who took pity on the sweet little strawberry and took her and her mother in to live with them. The book is really about her experience and the wounds that were left for her of that experience. And this is a snippet from her memoir, The Girl in the Red Coat. And it's about, as a child, she was about 7 or 8, having survivors come back and having groups of adults in her home talking about the horrors of war, and the few children who survived having to hear these stories. I can still hear the stories the grown-ups told. I won't ever be able to forget them. It didn't help putting my hand over my ears, creeping under the bed, or pulling the blanket over my head. There was no escape for us children. They had no pity on us. We were turned into involuntary witnesses by those who were bearing witness. And that's another major theme that we see throughout this literature, bearing witness. As soon as it got dark outside, the grown-ups would begin to talk about all they had lived through, about death, about unimaginable atrocities, about tortures, the agonies human beings are capable of inflicting on fellow human beings, and that their victims are able to endure. This was the time for lamentation and for grief. We'll see these themes repeated. The time for anger and bitterness. And after that, the voices of the survivors fell silent, and many of them for all time. And our generation, the generation of the children, of their children, we too no longer spoke of it. For Lagoka, it was her artwork that gave her a way of expressing it. And the next are slides of some of the work that she's done. And you'll see various pairs of eyes. This is a picture of her and her mother. Look at the quality of these eyes. They're key to her paintings. They appear overwhelmed by what they've seen, but their radiance overcomes the momentary terror, and I think this was a way that she was able to make sense of what she experienced as a youngster. The next memoir may be a name you're familiar with if you've done your e-reserve reading. Robert Nelson, who wrote the article showing the parallels between the Armenian Genocide and the Holocaust. He was actually a speaker here in the series last year. His family got false papers and passed as being non-Jewish. And the next slide has a picture of the young Nelson and his mother. Aren't these things nifty? And this is the cover of his memoir, False Papers, Deception and Survival in the Holocaust. For me, he grew up in Warsaw, in Poland. For me, what was most haunting was his discovery after the war that he was indeed Jewish. It was nearly comical, if the implications had not been so dreadful, that the very false papers, the phony birth certificates, and the Ken carton that had saved our lives during the Nazi occupation now threatened us with deportation once we fell under Soviet rule. My parents thought of burning them, but they were the only identification we had. So we soldiered on, me obliviously, as Zamchkowski. Bogusiu, there is something you must know, said Tadasiu, his father. while he glanced toward my mother. During the war? Yes. Well, during the war, and here my father began to grin broadly, and my mother suppressed a nervous giggle. Well, during the war, people do some strange things, right? Sure, I try to go along with what seemed to be a joke, or at least a funny story. Oh, what the hell, said Tadasuk, as he pushed off the windowsill and sat himself at my mother's feet on their bed. Bogusiu, you're a Jew. What? So I'm Jewish, I thought, without knowing what that meant, except, hadn't we killed Jesus? I looked up at the faces of my parents and realized that their smiles were those of chagrin, not of pleasure. It was almost as if the revelation of our true identity, which they had tried to pass off lightly, as almost a prank, had not been convincing. It was a joke. If it was a joke, it was a joke that had gone too far, and they seemed embarrassed by the result. As for me, the unintended butt of their prank, I felt confused, but also to some extent relieved at finally being included in the secret lore of my parents' lives. So many things suddenly became clear, and for that inclusion I was willing, and for the moment at least, to trade Christian for Jew, Zamashki for Mendelssohn, which was his birth name. And certainly growing up in the war and hearing all of the propaganda against Jews and believing that you were not one, only to find out after the war that you were, when you were 8 or 9, must have been very troubling for a young person. The next writer is probably the one who I put all of my stars in front of. I've never read a memoir anywhere like hers. Her name is Vodka Dennis. She was born in the city of Budapest. For those of you who didn't know, it's divided by a river. I thought it would be helpful to get a sense of what that city looked like. This is a much more recent picture. It's not from the time. It's her memoir of her life during World War II. She was 5 when the war began. Her father was a publisher of an anti-Nazi newspaper. And this is the part I find most disturbing, because what he did was he liquidated all of his assets and fled to the United States in 1939, taking every penny with him, and leaving his wife to care for Dennis and her adored older brother, Ivan. The book really describes the family's narrow escapes from Nazi detection. She went in hiding with her brother, her mother, her aunt, her cousin, who was 3 years her senior, and her grandparents. And at various times they were together, but mostly she was hidden apart and alone as a 6 and 7-year-old, and never knew when she was going to be left and when she was ever going to see her family again. Obviously, abandonment is a very important part of her work. And I think the family left her in safe houses thinking that that was the best way to make sure she survived. The story in the book ends when she's 12. None of the men in the family have survived. It's her mother, her aunt, and her grandmother, all of whom have recently lost somebody very close to them. And the young Magda has to say, excuse me, I know you're all grieving, but would somebody get me some food, or I'm the next to die? The family eventually ends up in a DP camp, displaced persons camp in Germany, then France, then by boat through Ellis Island to Cuba, where there's a family member who's willing to vouch for them. And at 17, she and her mother end up in the United States. She became a professor of psychoanalysis and psychotherapy at Albert Einstein University, College of Medicine. In New York City, she was a founding member of the Gestalt psychology community. And so what you see in her work is a lot of not only the child's memory, but the adult's ability to make sense of it. And her particular practice included many people who'd survived not just the Holocaust, but other kinds of assaults, particularly as children. Her memoir is called Castles Burning. Loneliness is always spoken of as a matter of lack, but loneliness is also a condition of surfeit, excess. It's too many runaway thoughts, too great a pull of gravity, too much attraction to the grave, too many shadows that turn into shades, too full a moon on which to wish in vain. Loneliness is the tombstone hung around your neck to carry until the day when at last it can be laid to rest above you. Later on she says, when you come down to it, fear is an entertaining emotion. It keeps everything inside you buzzing. It keeps you taut, tingling, alert, prepared to jump, ready to invent lies, set to overcome odds. Fear contains in itself possibilities of the spectacular. You could see the child's imagination. But the most pervasive emotion in me was not terror. It was disbelief. How could all this have happened? How? Could it have been foretold, prevented? My previous life receded. I was only this, a body on a bed. And I should say starving. Why should anyone want to harm me? I was disappearing anyway. And this was a time at which she was hiding in an attic over a flower shop. And during the day when there were customers in the shop, she was told she couldn't even read a book because the rustling of the paper might be heard. So she was literally lying in bed with nothing to entertain her, nothing to distract her during the daytime. And the next are some images. This is a image of the young Magda. Don't think it's as clear as I'd like it to be. And a lot of their escapes were by trolley car. And I think that that's a mode of transportation that existed at that time, and now we see the remnants of it. You might see some tracks when you go to Calistoga of the old trolley cars. And this is a scene of from Jacob the Liar, which was set in Budapest during the war. Still there? The next writer is Nehama Tech. She was born in 1931 in Lublin in Poland. By the time that Lublin was proclaimed free of Jews, the family had obtained false papers, and she and her sister moved in with a Christian family in a rural area about a half-hour train ride away. Her family then moved to a border village in the east and lived with another branch of the same Christian family until the end of the war. She was the first left so that her family's departure would not arouse their host's suspicions. Again, everybody's abandoned her. She's a small child, all on her own, with strangers who she hoped will protect her. The two girls, she and her sister, posed as the nieces of the Christian family, while their parents did not officially exist, never could go outside during this whole time period because they looked too stereotypically Jewish to risk being outside. The family they stayed with at the end of the war asked them to not let anyone else know that they had hidden them. Their protectors did not want their friends and neighbors to know they'd helped a Jewish family to survive. In the epilogue to her book, she also talks about the fact that she and her family went back to Lublin after the war, and there were threatened. Lots of anti-Semitism was still very prevalent in Lublin at the time, and it became so grave that she and her sister was sent to Lodz. You might remember that Lucille spent some of her time in the Lodz ghetto, where they again assumed non-Jewish names and identities to protect them. So, they kept on switching from being Jewish to Polish Christian to Jewish to Polish Christian. and finally left Poland for America in 1945. This is from her memoir called Reich Ears, and eventually I grew accustomed to anti-Semitic remarks. A slow transformation was taking place in me. It was as if, in certain circumstances, I lost track of who I really was and began to see myself as a Pole. I became a double person, one private and one public. I liked my new name. Feeling and believing myself to be Chrissia Bloch made life easier, and I felt less threatened when Jews were mentioned. These inconsistent and powerful emotions continued to battle within me, and I did nothing to reverse the process. In part, I did not know how to reverse it, and in part, I did not want to. Life moved on, and I became increasingly absorbed in my surroundings. And as I did, I offered less and less resistance to what was happening to me. So the willingness to actually take on that Polish identity. And again, as before, I felt an odd confusion of emotions. Fear because I was losing touch with my real self, but a kind of pleasure too because it was so easy to give up and become my newer, safe self. That however, the whole process of acknowledging who you really are was so threatening that it was easier to deceive yourself and others. Nahama Tech is a professor of sociology, and she's written about a group that we heard about just last week, the Belsky Brothers, who were involved in the Jewish partisan resistance movement, and also a book about men and women in the Holocaust that I'm looking forward to reading as soon as the semester's over. And this is an image from Lublin. The last of these survivors is one those of you who come on Sunday will get to hear much more about and actually meet. Ruth Gumbel did not write her own memoir. Rather, Barbara Lovenheim actually interviewed her and the members of her family. There, she was one of 7 Jews hidden in Berlin. It was thought that Berlin was free of Jews, but it turns out there were quite a number of people in hiding. But she was part of the largest group that survived. And I think it was Lucille Tech who talked about nightmares still haunting her, and I assume for many of the other survivors that's the case. But she had nightmares even during the war. She was a bit older, she was a teenager. She was hidden in a factory. She and others were able to go out at times at night, but never during the day. And she talks about the fact that she was there during some of the bombing. And so it was always a question of, do you go out and go into the shelters to avoid the air raids, or do you stay where you are for fear of being detected? When the all-clear siren sounded after an air raid, they would go back to bed, hearing the voices and footsteps of other tenants returning to their apartments. Ruth would usually fall asleep quickly, relieved, sorry for the typo, that the crisis had passed. But often she would dream that she was at the bottom of a steep hill. On the top were 2 large lions pawing the ground and growling. When Ruth turned around to look at them, they would run down the hill and chase her. Ruth ran and ran while they pursued her. And then she would wake up, shaking and petrified, and she would see her mother lying there, and she would move closer to her, hoping that Lena, who became her sister-in-law, one of the people who was in hiding with her, would make the lions go away. But the lions never left. They haunted her subconscious for many years. Even when she was safe and settled in America, the lions haunted her at night. And this is what Lovenheim says about this group. The Arndts remained the largest group known to have survived in hiding intact, but they were not aware of their unique status at the time, and as the truth about the concentration camps emerged, their relief at having survived was tempered by their growing awareness of the horrors experienced by fellow Jews and others. They vowed not to allow Hitler to ruin their lives or control their destiny. Now was not the time to renege on this vow by obsessively focusing on the terrors of the reign. Living courageously and fighting to create a better world, a world where such brutality could never again occur, was their only choice. and I hope you will join us on Sunday to see the playlet that Suzanne Batzdorf, who's in the back, has written about survival in Berlin, survival in the shadows, to get a chance to hear more of it and to also meet Ruth, who will be there on Sunday. And just a shot of Berlin. I think we've seen some that are like it. We have gone through a few examples, 4 to be exact, of children and teenagers who've survived. Do you see any parallels there? Do you see any themes? Can you connect it to any of the things that our survivors who've come to talk about us have spoken about? Or is this all kind of new and kind of hard to take in? Some of these are very painful memories, but they're very powerful, as Fedoria said. I want to switch to people who actually escaped, who were in Europe and Western Europe. Can we move forward a little bit on that one? We're going to keep going. Keep going. Great. Nellie Sachs was a bit older. She was born in 1891. She was a writer. She was born in Berlin. And she really remained largely ignorant of Jewish tradition and religion until well into her adulthood. In the mid-20s, she became an active member of the Jewish Cultural Association in Berlin. And after Kristallnacht in 1938, she managed to find a refuge for herself and her mother in Sweden. Because since 15, she had been corresponding with a Swedish novelist who helped her in getting out. Just as the tension and danger were reaching unbearable proportions, she had received her deportation papers. Her visa arrived, and Sachs and her mother were able to escape in May of 1940 on the last flight from Berlin to Stockholm. In 1943, Sachs learned of her lover's death, as well as the deportation of Jews to Auschwitz. She was filled with sorrow and despair about the fate of friends and relatives. Feelings mingled with a sense of guilt at having escaped their fate, and turned to her poetry as a vehicle for bearing witness to the memories of the dead and an instrument of mourning. And one of the first volumes of poetry that dealt with the Holocaust was her work, Oh, the Chimneys. She died a month after her friend and kindred poetic spirit, Paul Celan, committed suicide in Paris. But she did win the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1966. And the person giving the award talked about her lyrical and dramatic writing belonging to the great laments of literature, but the feeling of mourning which inspired you is free from hate and lends sublimity to the suffering of man. We honor you today as the bearer of a message of solace to all those who despair of the fate of man. Her poem, A Dead Child Speaks. My mother held me by my hand. Then someone raised the knife of parting so that it should not strike me. My mother loosed her hand from mine, but she lightly touched my thighs once more, and her hand was bleeding. After that, the knife of parting cut into each bite I swallowed. It rose before me with the sun at dawn and began to sharpen itself in my ears. Wind and water ground in my ear, and every voice of comfort pierced my heart. As I was led to death, I still felt, in the last moment, the unsheathing of the great knife of parting. And I think Sachs is one of the first writers who had not personally experienced the Holocaust, but was able to evoke that same power of her friend Paul Celan in her writing. And here a picture of some young ones in the camp. And Sachs is really a major poetic figure. A major writer of our time is Cynthia Zyk, who was born in 1928, and who wrestles really with the moral dilemma of writing about the Holocaust. And for those of you in the class, you'll be reading a short story of hers, The Shawl, and we'll have a little bit of it. She was born in 1928 in New York to Russian Jewish immigrants. Her own youth was marred by taunts of public school classmates calling her Christ killer when she refused to sing Christmas carols during school assemblies. The Shawl is really her only work set in a concentration camp. It starts kind of in the middle of a scene and focuses on two young women and an infant on a death march en route from one concentration camp to another, and talks about the kind of choiceless choices that existed during that time. And here's a short excerpt from The Shawl. Rosa entered the dark. It was easy to discover the shawl. Stella was heaped under it, asleep in her thin bones. Rosa tore the shawl free and flew. She could fly. She was only air, into the arena. The sunlight murmured of another life, of butterflies in summer. You might remember the last scene in the Diary of Anne Frank. The light was placid, mellow. On the other side of the steel fence, far away, there were green meadows speckled with dandelions and deep-colored violets. Beyond them, even farther, innocent tiger lilies, tall, lifting their orange bonnets. She stood for an instant at the margin of the arena. Sometimes the electricity inside the fence would seem to hum. Even Stella said it was only an imagining, but Rosa heard real sounds in the wire, grainy, sad voices. Dan Pages, like Paul Celan, was from the same area, the Bukovina area of Romania. He was born in 1930. He'd already experienced severe disorientation even before the Holocaust because his father emigrated to Palestine in 1934 without his wife and child, and his mother had died not long after that, and he was deported when he was 11. His family in Bukovina had been convinced that his father would be unable to support him, and because of this belief, Pages' family did not try to send him to Palestine, and thus he remained among the Jews who were swept away by Nazism. He was incarcerated for 3 years and spent his early adolescence in concentration camps in a territory near Russia, designed for the extermination of Jews deported from Romania. After the war, he ended up in Palestine, and at age 19, he started publishing poetry and scholarly works in Hebrew, a language he'd only recently acquired as a 16-year-old immigrant. I don't know too many people who are that good at a second language. Do you? I'd like you to look at this poem, and I'd like everybody to jot down something that it evokes for you. Written in pencil in the sealed freight car. Here in this carload, I am Eve with my son Abel. If you see my older boy, Cain, son of Adam, tell him that I... What kind of things came up for people? Anybody remember Cain and Abel from the Bible? Adam and Eve? What do you think's going on here? Could it be people in this boxcar maybe have some way of writing, some way of transmitting the last message? So Eve is with one son, and she really does not know where her husband and her other son are. It's also reminiscent of the murder of one son by another. If you remember the story of Cain and Abel. Death by the hands of one of one's own. But the thing that I found most surprising when I started looking at it is that there are 23 chromosomes that provide the blueprint for human life. You know, that 1/2 of the DNA strand, and there are 23 words in the poem. So it's as if Eve and her son are only half of a picture without the rest of the family there. And that ultimately the whole family will not survive. That's a lot to pack in 23 words, isn't it? Any other reactions? Yeah.
When I look at this poem, it makes me feel like the sense of it looking as if it's incomplete makes me feel like there are no words. There aren't words to describe how she feels.
Yeah.
So powerful.
It doesn't take reading a 500-page novel to get it, does it? Another poet that really moved me when I discovered her work was Karen Gershon. She was born in 1923 in Westphalia in Germany. And 5 weeks after Kristallnacht in 1938, she and her sister were sent by their parents to the arms of strangers, a Kindertransport to England. And there are many survivors, several of whom have come to this lecture series, who ended up escaping the war on these transports for children. They were taken in by mainly people in England, but in other countries as well. And the hope would be that they would be reunited with their families after the war. For the vast majority, there was not that possibility. Her parents ended up deported and not surviving. And she was really driven by a survivor's sense of guilt. She felt it was her duty to bear witness, and as a matter of fact, she wrote what she called a collective autobiography of children on the Kindertransport, one of the first works about the Kindertransport, in which she interviewed a whole bunch of people and then created one book rather than telling each individual story. She says, "The terrible past is not an adversary but my greatest asset. I will not fight against it, but put it to work. I cannot alter what has happened, but by making a tool of it, I can at least give it a purpose." And this is her poem, I Was Not There. The morning they set out, sorry about that, from home, I was not there to comfort them. The dawn was innocent with snow in mockery. It is not true the dawn was neutral, was immune. Their shadows threaded it too soon. They were relieved that it had come. I was not there to comfort them. One told me that my father spent a day in prison long ago. He did not tell me that. He went. What difference does it make now? When he set out, when he came home, I was not there to comfort him, and now I have no means to know of what I was kept ignorant. Both my parents died in camps. I was not there to comfort them. I was not there. They were alone. My mind refuses to conceive the life, the death they must have known. I must atone because I live. I could not have saved them from death. The ground is neutral underneath. Every child must leave its home. Time gathers life impartially. I could have spared them nothing, since I was too young. It is not true that they might have lived to succor me, and none shall say in my defense, had I been there to comfort them, it would have made no difference. And what follows are some photographs from children on the Kindertransport, often with a small bag with just a few possessions and a number around their neck. And I'm going to go on to another very short poem by Ruth Gumbel, whose family was from the area in Hungary that's now, or the Austro-Hungarian Empire, now Moldavia. And when she was 6 years old, she and her family emigrated to the United States, but then ended up moving to England. And hers is a very short poem, again, that packs quite a punch. Archival film material, and again, remember that last scene in Diary of Anne Frank with butterflies. At first it seemed a swaying field of flowers, wind blown beside a railway track, but then I saw it was the turning heads of men, unloaded from the cattle trucks at Auschwitz. One enormously powerful image. And I think for those who survived because of the luck of their family getting out, the fact of their survival haunted them, as if somehow or other they were spared for some particular reason and they needed to say something to the world to acknowledge that. We're going to go quickly through a few of the writers who were born after 1945 because their work is important too, and in a few weeks we're going to have a panel of survivors who are the second generation. And for them, trying to make sense of what happened is very difficult, and often is something that for them is very compelling. I inherited a suffering to which I had not been subjected. For without having to endure oppression, the identity of the victim was mine. The allotment was inescapable for them, utter abandonment and anonymous death, and for their spokesperson, sympathy and honor. I owed to the bond of blood this intoxicating power to confuse myself with the martyrs. No trace of them remains, except perhaps my taste for poppy seed bread, scorching hot tea, and the way I hold sugar in my teeth rather than let it dissolve. How do you cope when the most important events in your life occurred before you were born? What does this do to your sense of time? Do you really feel that you have a voice? And one of the most eloquent writers is Lily Brett, who was born in a displaced persons camp. Her parents spent most of the war in the Lodz ghetto and briefer internments in Auschwitz and Stuttgart. She emigrated with her parents to Australia in 1948. Her poem, I Keep Forgetting, is a relentless reminder to maintain the inventory of life and death in the camps. I keep forgetting the facts and statistics, and each time I need to know them, I look up books. Those books line 12 shelves in my room. I know where to go to confirm the fact that in the Warsaw Ghetto, there were 7.2 people per room, and in Lodz, they allocated 5.8 people to each room. I forget over and over again that 1/3 of Warsaw was Jewish, and in the ghetto they crammed 500,000 Jews into 2.4% of the area of the city. How many bodies they were burning in Auschwitz at the peak of their production? 12,000 a day. I have to check and recheck. And did I dream that at 4 p.m. on the 19th of January, 58,000 emaciated inmates were marched out of Auschwitz? Was I right to remember that in Bergen-Belsen, from the 4th to the 13th of April 1945, 28,000 Jews arrived from other camps? I can remember hundreds and hundreds of phone numbers. Phone numbers I haven't phoned for 20 years are readily accessible, and I can remember people's conversations and what someone's wife said to someone's husband. What a good memory you have, people tell me. The inability to be able to hold on to the numbers and the reality. And we're going to skip through the next poem. I'll have it posted for you. I wanted to end this segment with a German whose father was in the army during the war. His name is Hans-Jörg Stahlschmidt. Good, did I get it right? Yeah. Great. He grew up in Germany after the war. During the war, his father fought on the Russian front, and the fact that he'd been part of the German war machine led to endless fights between father and son. He says, "When I grew older and went to university, I, like many other students, got involved in fighting patriarchy. Our father's generation had destroyed half the world and brought shame to our country, and we were very angry about it. But over time, I got a different perspective on history. I saw old photos of my father when he was drafted, and I could see how young he looked. He was only 18. My father had dreams of becoming a musician, and they were all destroyed by the war. I started developing more empathy for my father and stopped looking at him from such a black and white point of view." He goes on to say, "Through my own experience as a parent, I became aware of the incredible sacrifices my parents had made for me." And in many ways, his poem has a lot of the same power as the others we've looked at. If You Could Lick My Heart. There was no bridge from Auschwitz back to the world. We made it up. We tried to find tales of good and heroic triumph. We attached hooks and ropes to the bottomless abyss of evil. But the ones who survived, helplessly watching their brother or child murdered, were never again at home in the world. Primo Levi, Tadeusz Borowski, Jean-Henri, Paul Celan, the list is longer than Schindler's. So let us be careful to know that we are the ones who were not there, that we are the ones who put words where there was nothing, put a light where there was only an unending starless night, put hope in that place where human hair piled up to a mountain of despair, which God's hand never crushed, but remained motionless behind smoke-filled clouds. Our imagining can barely touch the outer reaches of these experiences, he says, but allows us to dilute the deadly waters of that truth. You ask me for my impressions, Isaac Zuckerman, a leader of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, replied, and said, "If you could lick my heart, it would poison you." So the legacy, not only of the survivors, but those whose families were involved in some way in the war, even if it was unwillingly. And the last contemporary example is Savion Liebrecht, who was born in 1948 in a displaced persons camp and ended up immigrating to Israel. And she is really a writer who evokes the pain of being the child of survivors. She says, born into the Holocaust to parents who were broken, who had lost everything, including their language, their cultural background, and their optimism. And hopefully you will all have read the short story, Hayuda's Engagement Party. It really talks about the younger generation's disinterest in the survivor generation's story. And it's kind of this conspiracy of silence, of a disinterested world. And in the post-war period, there really was a silencing of survivors. It's no surprise that it took many of them 40 to 50 years to be able to come and share their stories. I think it was more common than uncommon that it took that amount of time. And this is a little bit from the short story. The years that followed hardened their hearts gradually. She's talking about the young girl Hayuda, her mother, the family. It became a habit over the laid tables on Sabbath and holiday eves and birthdays. Grandpa Mendel would tell them about people who dropped dead in the streets of the ghetto, and about other passerby who trampled them, or robbed them of their shoes, or rolled them to the side with their feet, and covered them with newspapers. He told them about those who died of starvation, with bloated bellies and sunken eyes, and about the man who sorted the victim's clothes and found his wife's dress with pearls embroidered on the front, the dress he had bought her when their son was born, and which he couldn't mistake because the hem was torn and was repaired with red thread. And when the Germans saw him linger over the dress in his hand, he suspected him of trying to steal the pearls and hit him on the neck with a whip. And about the boy who carried the bodies to the crematoriums, who found his mother among the dead. They let him talk, blocking the path to their hearts. Whenever he rose to his feet and lifted his right arm with a goblet in his hand, they knew that the moment had arrived. Had her father forgotten the death and the fear and the hunger? How would he lock them in his heart and never mention them for 40 years? And now, how had his locked memories awakened in him, in the presence of all the abundance and the songs and the conciliatory atmosphere that permeates the illuminated rooms on holidays? And I hope we'll have a chance to talk about the short story in section on Thursday. We've covered a huge number of writers, probably a lot of themes, and I hope we can start drawing them out. There are writers who talk of mourning and lamentation: Elie Wiesel, Paul Celan, Ruth Feinleit, the impact of passing as being non-Jewish, the determined to live and bear witness, the impact on families, the legacies of survival, the need to keep memories alive, especially for the second-generation survivors and the children of German soldiers. But this writing is not limited to those who survived the Holocaust, nor are these the themes that represent just the Holocaust. I think we can see them evoked in other genocides. And I want to end with just two very short pieces. One from the Armenian genocide by Michelle Arion Marcon, born in 1968, from her novel 3 Apples Fell from Heaven. And when she thinks of herself, she imagines herself walking along the narrow streets endlessly, stopping at the places that have views of the Anatolian plains, which stretch beyond the town, and on a clear morning in spring, allow her to see Mesra and sometimes even the Armenian village Hulake. But as she nears Hulake, she sees that it lies empty, and only the wind occupies the eaves. Only cats live in the houses that are no longer houses, but half burned and cleared of wood. They took it for the previous winter, falling down mud brick piles. And here are some images from Armenia. You remember the genocide took place during World War I. And a more contemporary one, and one that we'll be having a chance to learn more about next week, is the Rwandan genocide that happened 11 years ago. It is too fresh for us to have the kind of reflection of time. And so there is very little written so far about the Rwandan genocide, but I imagine those scholars who come next in the next 40 years are going to see more and more. We're beginning to see more films, and I would imagine the literature is going to evolve, but this was a poem I discovered in a publication that our speaker for next week, Matilda Lucan-Tabanya, was responsible in part for getting published. They are gone. What have you done? They are gone. They were dads and moms killed in genocide programs, leaving survivors pell-mell in horrors they can't quell. What have you done to make them live well and end their genocide spell? Don't let bygone be bygone till their killers go to hell or die in some prison cell. They are gone. They were brothers and sisters killed by fellow ministers who are still roaming free to continue killing spree. What have you done to uproot this lethal pedigree and end their family tree? Don't let bygone be bygone, till with all of us you agree to nab them in some degree. They were gone. They were moral leaders killed by genocide pleaders, leaving immoral vultures who practice corrupt ventures. What have you done to build political structures to rectify these departures? Don't let bygone be bygone till you visit each prefecture to restore our lost culture. They are gone. They were eminent scholars killed by hoodlum superstars, leaving a genocide quake whose tremors still shake. What have you done before you decide to undertake some policies of give and take? Don't let bygone be bygone till you correct past mistake, to ensure your survival at stake. They were gone. They were young and strong, killed by genocide prong, that seems to never forget that you are the next target. What have you done to dodge your enemy's bullet before burying the hatchet? Don't let bygone be bygone till your objectives are set to survive on this planet. Thank you. We have a little time left for questions if there are any. I think there's a question down here in the front row.
Who's your favorite? I mean, who?
It's hard.
I know.
It's really
If
hard.
you had one,
It would be either Lily Brett or Karen Gershon that have pulled me the most. And of the memoirs, it would be Vodka Dennis. I could not stop. I think I went to bed at 4 in the morning. I started at 8 in the morning. It was just so compelling.
will you post a bibliography?
I will, and I will also post all of the slides and text, so the PowerPoint will be available for everyone, so you can look at it in a little more leisure and contemplate. And please send me emails, find me, let me know what you think. My hope is to have started a process of thinking, because sometimes literature allows us access in ways that war and genocide doesn't. Sometimes it illuminates, and I kept on having ahas as I was reading this, of parallels between the literary works and the words of our survivors this year. And I hope this will give you another avenue of looking at the Holocaust and really seeing what your role can be in stopping genocide. And I hope that many of you will come down and join the Human Rights Club, support their efforts. I know that the club has designated a group that's providing education to children in the displaced persons camps in Sudan as the prime reason for all of their fundraising. It's not to raise money for the Human Rights Club, it's to raise money for the victims of genocide. Any other questions? Yeah?
Unrelated, but today on KPFA I heard that our government has an alliance with the Sudanese government and not the people who are suffering from genocide.
I hadn't heard that coverage, but it doesn't surprise me because there's also oil reserves. And that can influence policy sometimes, even though the United States did come out and say there's a genocide going on in Sudan. As Jerry Fowler says, that's all we've done. We haven't done anything really to help prevent any further action there. Others? Hope to see you all Thursday. People in my section who did not pick up essay number 2, I have it for you after. Thank you.